So Phoebe brings a wealth of experience and expertise to her role as the Australian Country Director at Minviro.
Thank you, Christy, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I will be presenting today on the regulations, green premiums, and the impacts on raw materials. And a quick agenda. So I'll briefly introduce Minviro. We're fairly new to Australia. And then I'll also introduce life cycle assessments. And that's really where the regulations and the conversations around green premiums are starting to arise. And then I'll put a bit of case studies into this on the raw materials themselves. So Minviro, we are a specialized service company helping raw materials to downstream battery manufacturers quantify the environmental impacts of producing their products or processes. And we recently set up an office here in Perth in August last year. I got the privilege of moving over from London, and then we're also based in London and China. And these are some of our clients. So we are mainly based across the raw material sector all the way down to that downstream battery manufacturer and OEMs. And the whole purpose of the company is looking at life cycle assessments. So what is a life cycle assessment? Essentially, it's a method to quantify the environmental impacts of producing a product or a process throughout its entire life cycle. So it's all compliant to an ISO standard, and these are the ISO 14040, 14044, and ISO 14067. So the ILIA product carbon footprint is following those standards as well. It does not only look at climate change, which a lot of regulations are looking at today. And to put a number on it, it actually looks at 16 environmental impact categories. If you are paying eager attention and you're counting all of the figures, there is only 13, but trust me, they do split off into subcategories. Zoning into climate change a little bit more. So in your current greenhouse gas protocol, you're looking at your scope 1 and 2 for operations. Now, in a life cycle assessment, we're looking at the impact of a product or a process, not the entire operation, even though that is feasible. And you have to look at your scope 3 emissions. Your scope 3 emissions are not just emissions around upstream or downstream transport. These are the embodied impacts associated with all the raw materials that you're consuming in your process. So if you've got a concentration process and you are consuming reagents, it will account for the embodied impact of those reagents. So to the more exciting part of this presentation, why is any of that really that important? So these are just the top 5 of the main policies that are either have been introduced or being introduced, of which Australia was introducing their green industry policy just last week. And the main focuses of my presentation are very much going to be around the EU battery passport. But one to note is definitely the battery ID in China. So the EU battery passport and the battery ID in China are pretty much the same thing-ish. But essentially what they're looking at is how the environmental impacts of critical raw materials affect the manufacturing of a battery. So Keith earlier mentioned some great stats on how many EVs we are going to need in the future and the demand for EVs. Now, to put an added perspective on this, the EU battery passport is essentially saying that as of 2025, in February 2025, which is less than a year away, the carbon footprint needs to be declared for every single electric vehicle battery being sold into the EU market. Now, what that essentially means is that that carbon footprint declaration has to be done by a certain standard, of which the ISO standards is one of the only recognized ways of quantifying this. And now that you're all experts in life cycle assessments, you all know that that battery being sold into the EU is going to include its scope 3 emissions. And if you're a lithium producer, a nickel producer, or a cobalt producer, or anything else, you are that battery's scope 3 emissions. The other important aspect of this slide is the 2028. So what's happening in 2028 is a carbon footprint threshold. Essentially, not only do you have to declare what your carbon footprint is for your battery going into your electric car, you also need to meet a carbon threshold. If you are over this threshold, you will be penalized, which will most likely be in the form of financial taxes. Now, into green premiums. I don't think it's too unknown that green premiums are semi-alive in the aluminium world. And what you can see here from the financial review is that in April 2023, just last year, you've got European car makers actually choosing to pay a small premium on green aluminium from South32, which is Australia-based, as well as Caprol Aluminium has been selling an almost zero carbon aluminium product at a 5% price premium. So there is a small amount of movement in that space. But how does it affect the battery raw material space, specifically nickel? So in the past month, it's been very, very topical looking at green premiums. And what we've found is there's been a huge call for global producers who are listed on the LME to introduce a green premium market for cleaner nickel. And as we know, the current nickel supply chain, which is being dominated by Indonesia, is not very clean, let's say. So the call has happened, and what that essentially means is, I hate to disappoint everyone, a green premium doesn't actually exist right now, but there has been a small amount of movement. And what that movement is that the LME have partnered with a company called Metals Hub, which is a buyers and traders sellers platform. And what Metals Hub have introduced is a way of companies who are wanting to sell their nickel on the LME, they can basically classify or promote their ESG characteristics, of which carbon footprint is one of them. And the most important thing around this is that that carbon footprint has to be done by product carbon footprint guideline, of which we very much contributed in writing. And as a result, it has to include your scope 3 emissions. You can't just report on your scope 1 and 2, which is mandatory as part of your greenhouse gas protocol. And finally, so if you are looking at declaring your carbon footprint of your product on the LME, and then a buyer is allowed to then select or filter the products that they want to buy using a lower carbon footprint source, you have to use the PCF, which is the product carbon footprint. And if you do not have primary data, you can also utilize the secondary data that we have built in our internal databases that are also part of the Metals Hub platform. So going into the raw materials. What you are seeing on here is Tesla's 2022 climate change or global warming potential reports for an NCA battery cell and an LFP battery cell. And you can see that out of 100% of the impacts in the terms of the carbon footprint of the battery cell, the majority of it is going to sit in your upstream raw materials. So that top figure, looking at the NCA, the majority of the impact sits in your nickel supply chain. And then for an LFP, the majority of your impact is sitting in that graphite supply chain. Now, the reason this is important is because if you are wanting to sell your battery, or your Tesla are wanting to sell their batteries or cars, let's say, into the EU, following the EU battery passport as of February next year, they need to declare their carbon footprints, and that has to include their scope 3, and then by 2028, for them to benefit from any form of financial incentive, they need to lower their carbon footprint below the threshold. Now, this is a figure showing the impacts of nickel in nickel sulfate hexahydrate from 3 different processes. If you're looking at the rotary kiln electric furnace process from an Indonesian laterite and it's refined in China, your impact is sitting just under 100 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. That definitely does not meet the LME's green premium. And on the flip side, if you're going to look at nickel sulfide from the pyromet process in Canada, your impact is significantly lower. The exact same can be seen with graphite. So if you're, in this case, Syra Resources, they looked at the impact of producing anode-grade graphite compared to your conventional Chinese supply chain, of which China is very much dominating it. And you can see that the impacts in China for graphite are immense. So right now, battery manufacturers are very much looking to diversify outside of China, purely on the intense CO2 footprints of all of these products. So they can also meet the demands of upcoming regulations. And finally, bringing it a bit closer to home, Pilbara Minerals. So Pilbara Minerals here have been looking at the impact of their product for producing lithium hydroxide monohydrate. Now, by partnering with Calix and looking at an electric calcination process instead of the conventional coal-fired rotary kiln calcination process for their hydroxide product, they managed to receive up to an 80% impact reduction, which is pretty significant if you're looking at selling to a downstream battery manufacturer who is then wanting to sell their product into the EU. And the final thing is that this is not just related to the EU. So if you're looking at the IRA in the US, you have to prove your environmental or your carbon footprint more particularly. And this has to include your scope 3 as well. And you need to prove that you're having some form of decarbonization plan. You can't just say this is your impact and Bob's your uncle, pretty much. So finally, when is the best time to do an LCA? The best time very much is when you're either in that project development phase or just going into an operation. Purely just because if you do suddenly decide to do any form of decarbonisation plans, or you're looking at minimising your impact, when you already have a full-scale operation, it's quite hard just to quickly redesign the flow sheet. However, when you're in that pre-phase, phase stage, you still have a lot of flexibility. So that's kind of the best time to understand what your base case is and where you want to get to, and identifying where your hotspots are so you can actually mitigate those directly to get to your end sustainability goals that you've been making. On the flip side, you're more than welcome, of course, to apply this sort of work, and you will have to if you have an operation and you're selling into that EV battery market. However, the ability to influence using environmental decision-making will just be slightly reduced purely on the choices you're allowed to make. And that's it. Thank you very much.